My name is Mark Lanier. I've got the first 10 minutes of today to do an introduction to what we're about, as well as an introduction to Tom's latest book, Paul, a Biography. This is also a special event because this is the inaugural event for Baylor University's Truett Seminary, which is opening a Houston campus, has opened a Houston satellite campus. This is the inaugural event that we're doing in concert with each other. And so Todd is back here. Todd Still, who is the dean of that school, concocted this idea, and I'll introduce Todd more in a moment, but it's an honor to do this with Baylor. So you've got a table out there for Baylor. You'll also have a tailor this afternoon or this evening if you need your suit taken in. No, it's a different kind of table. Not a tailor. You'll have a table that talks about some online courses that you can take from Tom Wright. David Seamuth is somewhere. There's David. Stand up. So David helps put this together. It's a way to study, and he's brought these coupons, which include a free course. So you can use this. You can also get other courses that are available. And I've watched some of those. They are tremendous. And I eagerly urge you to consider doing that as well. Now, I have used 4 of my minutes. I've got 6 more to introduce the book and the panel. I'm going to start with the panel, but I'm not going to give a lot of detail about them because then I don't have time to talk about the book. So let's start with the ladies. I'll start right here. Dr. Shively Smith, come on up here, Dr. Smith. She is a professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. She's an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She has a bachelor's degree from Fisk University, the second best school in Tennessee. An MDiv, that's where my undergraduate's from, down the street from Fisk. Sorry, at Lipscomb. An MDiv from Emory University, a Master's of Theology from Columbia Theological Seminary, and a PhD from Emory. She is a specialist in the Petrine and general epistles in the New Testament, and we welcome her to the panel today. Next, Dr. Judy Gundry. Judy, please come up and grab a seat. And no, we can't do that. Yeah, if women are up here together, they'd have to be on the right because women are all right. No, you sit here and to the audience, you're all right. So Judy Gundry was born into a theological family. Her father wrote one of the textbooks I studied in, these many years ago, a New Testament introduction, Bob Gundry, and he's still alive at 86. But Judy, his daughter, is a scholar in her own right without regard to who her father is. She is a research scholar and associate professor of New Testament at Yale Divinity School. Her bachelor's degree is from Westmont College. Her master's is from Fuller Seminary. And her doctor of theology is from the University of Tübingen. She's a Pauline scholar, a New Testament scholar. She's got a new book coming out that we hope she'll be back to lecture on in about a year from a section of Paul's letter. We call it 1 Corinthians. It wasn't his 1 Corinthian letter, but it's the one that we consider, unless you follow certain people, and they would call it 1 Corinthians. So we're delighted to have Judy with us. Next, Dr. Seyoon Kim. Dr. Kim, I'm going to move you down to this end because we're saving the middle for Tom. So one of these two seats would be great. Dr. Kim is professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary's main campus in California. He's got a bachelor's degree from Seoul National University. So lots of people study spiritual things. He's a specialist in the soul. He's got a bachelor's of divinity from the Asian Center for Theological Studies, and he got his PhD from the University of Manchester in northern England. He was recently voted the most influential Korean theologian in an opinion poll conducted among Korean pastors. And so we welcome him. It's a delight to have him here and an honor as well. And then, of course, Dr. Still. Todd, would you please come, grab your seat, And Dr. Still, Todd Still, we love him especially because his wife grew up at our home church, Champion Forest Baptist Church. But Todd has taught in a number of places for the last decade or so. He has been running Truett Seminary at Baylor. He conceptualized and organized this panel. And so we thank him for that. He's the dean there. He's also the William Henson Professor of Christian Scriptures at Baylor University. He co-sponsors this, and his bachelor's is from Baylor, his MDiv, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and his PhD from the University of Glasgow. And last, the man that needs no introduction whatsoever is N.T. Wright. Tom, would you please come up here? Can you all give Tom a round of applause? Thank you, my friend. Since Tom is the reason we're all here, he needs no introduction. I've got a minute and a half left. Let me tell you the format. I go for 10 minutes. Then we're going to have 10 minutes from each of these speakers. And so we're going to start with Dr. Kim, who's going to speak on chapters 1 through 4 of the book. Then we're going to go to Dr. Gundry. Judy will speak on chapters 5 through 8. Shively, Dr. Smith will speak on chapters 9 through 12. Todd will bring up the end of the book, 13 through 15. Each of them have 10 minutes. I will stand up after 10 minutes. They will know their time is up and they will wrap up. And then that will give Tom 20 minutes to respond. And that will give us 30 minutes for a little dialogue at the end of the response that I will moderate. So within that, Paul is one of the most pivotal people in history. If you think about it, Paul is a gentleman who truly changed the world. God, through Paul, brought the Christian message in the form in which most of us are familiar, in a way that was very different than how he started his life. So he starts his life, and we'll walk through this with some of the panel. I've got a lot to discuss with them when they get through their presentations. But he starts his life as a zealous Pharisee of Pharisees. He starts his life persecuting the church, believing out of zeal for God that is the right thing to do. On the road to Damascus, something profound happens. Y'all come on in through the side doors and you'll find an easier seat. Something profound happens on the road to Damascus. We would not say that Paul was converted. He was not converted. He found the fruition of his Jewish understanding of God and God's redemptive work on the road to Damascus and in his subsequent exploring and understanding of what that meant. So with that, I pass the floor to begin this wonderful panel to Dr. Kim. Would you please spend 10 minutes and tell us about chapters 1 through 4?
Well, I'm honored to be invited to participate in this panel discussion of this great theologian, if not the greatest New Testament scholar of our days, to celebrate his book, Biography. This is a book that demonstrates Tom Wright's great erudition, especially his sovereign knowledge of not only New Testament, but also the Old Testament and much of the Second Temple Jewish literature, his fantastic imaginative power, and his matchless rhetorical skills. With such rich resources, for decades, Wright has stimulated and challenged New Testament scholarship with most creative and brave new proposals for interpreting the New Testament, especially the teachings of Jesus and Paul. In this book, he distills and presents them in a more popular style for a broader readership, assessing as well the significance of Paul for the entire human civilization or for the redemptive history of God. That is the introductory general remark for the whole book. But then now on the part 1, beginnings, which has been assigned for me to discuss. Wright narrates the life and work of Saul Paul according to his autobiographical account in Galatians 1:13-17, and the Lucan accounts in Acts. By the way, Wright writes a biography of Paul essentially following the narrative of Acts, taking them as historically reliable and integrating into them what he can gather from his letters, both the historical data and the theological contents. This procedure is quite agreeable to me, but it would have made many critical scholars of a generation or so ago turn in their graves. So Wright narrates the life and work of Saul Paul according to his autobiographical account in Galatians 1:13-17, and the Lucan accounts in Acts. Having moved from Tarsus to Jerusalem in his teens, Saul studied under Gamaliel, but followed not his more humane Hillelite tradition, but the opposite Shammai tradition with his zeal, with readiness to punish violently those who departed from the ancestral tradition or undermined it after the examples of Phinehas, Elijah, and the Maccabees. Saul Paul persecuted the Jesus followers for claiming that Jesus, the crucified impostor, was the Messiah, and for threatening thereby to displace with him the Torah and the temple. Saul pursued those renegades of the ancestral tradition to Damascus in the hope that such act of his zeal would be reckoned to him as righteousness, as Phinehas experienced according to the Numbers 25. On the way to Damascus, according to our author Wright, Saul meditated on the chariot throne vision of Ezekiel 1, seeking to glimpse for himself what the prophet had seen, as many pious and zealous Jewish sages did in their longing for God's coming to his temple to renew the entire creation. And there he saw, in his mind's eyes, a vision of Jesus enthroned on the throne on which Paul expected to see God. And there he realized that Jesus of Nazareth was indeed the fulfillment of Israel's scriptures, but also at the same time he realized that the way Saul had been reading the scriptures up to that point was completely wrong. God, the Creator, had raised Jesus from the dead, declaring not only that the crucified one really was Israel's Messiah, but that he had done what God had promised to do himself in person. He glimpsed the glory of God in the face of Jesus the Messiah. So heaven and earth were now fused together. It was about Jesus as being in person, the reality toward which the temple itself had pointed. After this experience, Saul was baptized by Ananias and received Jesus' own spirit, and he went on to synagogue in Damascus and announced that Jesus was the Son of God, Israel's long-awaited Messiah. Israel's hope has been fulfilled, the King has been enthroned. In Galatians 1:13-17, Paul says that after receiving this revelation of the gospel and the apostolic call for the Gentiles, he went away to Arabia. Concerning this trouble, assuming that by Arabia Paul meant Mount Sinai, Wright suggests that Saul went to Mount Sinai in order to have his new shocking revelation confirmed as the fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant at the place where that covenant was first ratified, and that he returned to Damascus with a new commission to announce the new king, Jesus the Messiah, just as Elijah did. Wright grants that the echoes of Elijah's story are small, but he still thinks that they are so close and therefore so significant. But in 1 Kings 19, there is no mention of Elijah going to Arabia. He is said to have gone only to wilderness and then later to Mount Horeb. But Paul does not say that he went to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, but rather to Arabia. Would Paul have meant Mount Sinai by Arabia in Galatians 1:17 when he is going to refer to Mount Sinai in the same letter of Galatians 4 in a pejorative way? Mount Sinai in Arabia is Hagar and corresponds to the present Jerusalem. For Moses and Elijah, Mount Sinai has a positive meaning of God's revelation. But it was otherwise for Paul. If he had received the confirmation of the Damascus revelation of the gospel and his apostolic commission for the Gentiles at Mount Sinai, would Saul have now referred to that mountain in a positive way rather than in this negative sense as in Galatians 4? I would argue that there is here no exact parallel with Elijah, but rather contrast. But time does not allow me to demonstrate this point. Elsewhere, I have suggested that Paul interpreted his apostolic call for the Gentiles in terms of the call of the servant of Yahweh of Isaiah 42, as well as that of Isaiah 49, to be a light to the Gentiles. And that inspired by the reference in Isaiah 42:11 to the inhabitants of Kedar and Selah, rejoicing at the ministry of the servant, Paul went to Kedar and Selah, which were then understood as Arabia, in order to preach the gospel to their inhabitants, the descendants of Nebaioth, the oldest son of Ishmael. I suggest that this theory of Paul's mission to the children of Ishmael in the Nabatean kingdom can nicely support Wright's efforts to interpret Paul's mission in terms of bringing about the eschatological family of Abraham. In carrying out his mission to bring in the nations into the family of Abraham, Paul could well have thought that he must first start with the Gentile nation nearest to Israel, or with uniting the descendants of the two sons of Abraham, Isaac and Ishmael. Of course, this theory fits well with Paul's escape from Damascus over the wall in the basket. It is quite noteworthy that in explaining Paul's apostolic call at Damascus Road, our author Wright neglects Paul's emphasis on God's grace. Paul's testimonies about Damascus' experience, both in Galatians 1:13-16 and 1 Corinthians 15:8-10, make abundantly clear how much he appreciated God's grace in his forgiveness of his persecutor activities and in his apostolic calling. So much so that Paul regularly refers to his apostleship with the formula, the grace that was given to me. But Wright narrates Paul's Damascus experience without any reference to God's grace. In fact, there are few references to grace in this whole book, and it does not feature at all in the index. Wright does not reflect either. Wright does not reflect either on Paul's understanding of his apostleship as the oikonomos, or steward of the divine mystery, God's plan of salvation in Ephesians 3 and Colossians 1, which is stressed in these passages, which is very important for Wright for his whole meta-narrative interpretation of Old and New Testament. It is odd for Wright to neglect it while stressing so much about Paul having been motivated in his apostolic ministry by messianic eschatology of fulfillment of God's age-old plan to bring about Abraham's family consisting of believing Jews and Gentiles, whose understanding Wright gets confirmed by especially Ephesians 1 and 2. About Tarsus, Wright calls Saul's time at Tarsus in AD 36 to 46 as a silent decade. According to him, during the period, while working at the family business of tent making, Saul prayerfully thought through Israel's scriptures and the traditions anew in the light of this new fact of the crucified and risen Messiah, and so worked out his basic gospel or theology, which he was to preach and teach in the years to come. The gospel or theology that is centered on the thoughts that Israel's God is the one God of the whole world, and that the crucified and risen Jesus is the Messianic King, not only of Israel, but the whole world, and that the worldwide family of Abraham, consisting of Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus the Messiah, is to be realized in fulfillment of the divine promises to Abraham. But here Wright takes no consideration of the teaching and deeds of Jesus, the historical Jesus, in discussing the ingredients that went into developing Paul's gospel or theology during Tarsus years. Now, here in this biography of Paul, does Jesus' tradition, not even his faithful temple action, feature? This is unexpected of Wright, as elsewhere he has often stressed the importance of Jesus' tradition for Paul, and makes much of the Messianic Jesus fulfilling the meaning of the temple in this book. What Paul must have learned about the historical Jesus first in Damascus, and then in the fortnight visit with Peter just before his return to Tarsus, must have contributed decisively in his interpretation both of the meaning of the crucified and risen Messiah Jesus and the Old Testament, the Jewish traditions in forming his theology as a whole. One of the themes that Wright highlights as a fruit of Paul's meditation during his Tarsus years is that while Saul the Zealot had expected a Messiah to defeat the pagan hordes, Paul the Apostle came to believe that the Messiah had defeated the dark powers that stood behind all evil. According to Wright, this translated directly into one of the great themes of his mature thought, and particularly his pastoral efforts, the unity of all Messiah people across ethnic boundary lines. Wright claims that this is the root of Paul's understanding of his Gentile mission. After explaining Paul's understanding of the Messiah Jesus' victory over evil forces, as well as his kingship of the whole world, Wright stresses that those understandings led to see one worldwide family of Abraham across the Jew-Gentile boundary lines, coming into being in fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. But strangely, Wright neglects to stress Messiah's worldwide kingly reign, to which all the nations are to render the obedience of faith. To be sure, Wright does refer to it often in his book, but he never makes any efforts to expound it, his litany of God's kingdom on earth as in heaven notwithstanding. Where he should be speaking about the kingdom of God and his son Jesus Messiah, for example, in connection with Psalm 2, a favorite psalm of Wright, he switches the subject of his explanation from Jesus, the Messianic King, immediately to Abraham's family and dwells on the latter in length. This one-sided view leads him to explain Paul's gospel of justification only in terms of bringing about the worldwide family of Abraham consisting of believing Jews and Gentiles, but to neglect more or less totally the more fundamental idea of the lordship change, justification as a redemption of sinners from the satanic kingdom of sin and death into God's and his Son's kingdom of righteousness and life, as Paul states in Colossians 1:13-14. This in turn leads him to neglect seeing Paul's ethics deriving from his gospel of justification. It also makes his counter-imperial interpretation of Paul's gospel quite abstract, sometimes even confusing, at least to me. We should not forget that in Romans, in which Paul expounds his gospel of justification most comprehensively and systematically, he frames it within the inclusion of the rule of the Davidic Messiah, Jesus, God's Son, over all the nations, Romans 1, 3-5 and 15:12, and defines his apostleship in terms of a divine commission for him to bring all the nations to the obedience of faith, to the kingship or lordship of the Davidic Messiah, Jesus, installed as God's Son, rather than bringing the Gentiles into the membership of the eschatological family of Abraham. Antioch. Wright narrates Paul's joint ministry with Barnabas in Antioch according to Acts 11. For the significance of this period of Paul, Wright says, the ways of reading Scripture and interpreting the Jesus events that we find fully grown in Paul's mature letters were taking shape. Pretty much every idea he later articulated had been road-tested in Antioch. Well, he says, I have one paragraph.
Okay.
Very generous host. Here, Wright assumes that until coming to Antioch to join in the ministry of Barnabas, Saul was spending a silent decade in Tarsus. But it is difficult to imagine that after receiving the apostolic commission from God to preach the gospel of God's Son, Jesus Christ, on the Damascus Road, after having begun to preach that gospel already in Damascus, and after having consulted Peter and James in Jerusalem during his fortnight visit there, Saul spent a silent decade in Tarsus, just meditating on the gospel and working out his theology while carrying out his tent-making trade. And it is also difficult to believe that Barnabas sought out such a Saul in such a state, whom he met only very briefly in Jerusalem some 10 years ago. Isn't it more credible that Saul continued his apostolic ministry of preaching the gospel in Tarsus as he had done in Damascus and Arabia and Jerusalem, and that he was already making a name as famous as N.T. Wright today in Tarsus? so that the Barnabas sought out, went to invite him to join in his ministry in Antioch. Well, I have time only for that.
Okay. Thank you so much. Okay. You only went over by 10 minutes. So that was good. Dr. Gundry, next.
Is it my time? Yeah.
You've
Okay.
got your 10
All right.
minutes. We'll just, we'll figure this out.
All right. So I very much echo Seyoon's comments about the wonderful erudition that is distilled in this book, decades of learned scholarship, and in a highly readable format, engaging. We not only follow Paul's theology as Tom Wright presents it, but we get into his head. We experience what it was like for him as a boy growing up, what his experience was learning Torah, learning it backwards and forwards, his experience in his missionary travels, and so on. So I very much enjoyed reading your book, Tom, and I'm delighted to offer some more global comments about chapters 5 to 8. So in this book, we really do get a picture of Paul the missionary, the contextual theologian, what it was like for him on the road. The book is full of maps which help you visualize where Paul went, from what journeys, what routes he took, what cities he visited, and it really is a fascinating combination of both the conceptual and the visual learning that we can benefit from. So my question is, or the question that Tom Wright poses in these chapters that I'd like to deal with is, what was Paul up to when he went around ancient Turkey and Greece, finally coming to Rome itself, preaching and founding churches? What did he think he was doing? And why did he do it? Tom suggests that Paul was motivated by two basic convictions, at least two. These were the ones that stood out to me. First, Paul was convinced that the Jewish expectation of the Messiah to come and rule the whole world was fulfilled. And Jesus was this universal ruler. And that he had brought God's kingdom on earth. Now, everyone owed loyalty to Jesus as Lord, and not to Caesar or the gods, and not even to Torah. So Paul's preaching on his missionary journeys had a very strong political overtones. It wasn't just religious. It wasn't about going to heaven. And in any case, no one in the ancient world would have separated those two anyway. Religion and politics belong together. So what Paul was preaching and what his audience believed about religion had to do with the intricacies of everyday life. It touched all of life. So with this message, a political and religious message, Paul went to, according to Tom, the key centers of Roman rule and of Roman cult, to preach that Jesus was now Lord over all, and in this way to facilitate Jesus' takeover of these cities. Takeover is my word. But I think it is an apt word for what Tom is getting at. Paul thought that when he preached Jesus, that Jesus actually became a living presence in these communities where the message was heard and the response was, Kyrios Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ is Lord, or Jesus Messiah is Lord. So actually, in fact, a new world order came into being wherever Paul preached Jesus, and the response was loyalty to Jesus. He wasn't merely preaching a heavenly hope. Second, Paul was utterly convinced that God had fulfilled the ancient promise to Abraham of a worldwide family. And this family consisted of non-Jews as well as Jews. So it was not just a quantitatively universal family, everybody, but it was a qualitatively universal family. Not only Jews, but also non-Jews. And it consisted of all who were loyal to Jesus, regardless of their ethnicity. Loyalty to Jesus was the identity mark of the eschatological family of God. Further, this worldwide family, universal family, was a, quote, an experiment in a way of being human together that had never been tried in the world before. Quote, there really was no analogy in the ancient world for a movement of this kind, end quote, by which Tom means an extended family without ties of kinship or ancestral symbols or a geographical focus such as Jerusalem, the temple, or a central authority like that of Caesar. So those were Paul's two convictions. Messiah Jesus has come as the universal Lord on earth. His kingdom is now. Everyone must proclaim loyalty to him, and the worldwide family promised to Abraham is fulfilled, and it consists of Jews and non-Jews who are loyal to Jesus. So how did Paul argue his case? That Jesus is now the universal Lord. According to Tom, when Jesus died, he defeated the dark powers of the world that grip and distort and ultimately destroy human societies and individuals. And these dark powers are the equivalent of the gods, including the emperor who claimed to be a son of God and demanded worship as divine. Tom says, quote, something happened when Jesus died, as a result of which the Satan, the accuser, and any dark forces that might be loosely lumped together under such a label no longer had any actual authority, end quote. So Jesus' death emasculated the dark powers that enslaved the rest of the world. He says also that Jesus' victorious death over the powers was incorporative. Jesus took the world with him in his death and re-emerged in a new form or with a new identity in the resurrection, and thus brought about a, quote, whole new world, end quote. The resurrection was the proof that Jesus had defeated the dark powers. And so the obvious conclusion was, quote, the door to the prison stood open. They, that is non-Jews, were now free to leave, end quote. How then did Paul argue his case for the worldwide family of Abraham being a reality? Well, the uncircumcised Gentiles who gave their allegiance to Messiah Jesus did receive the Spirit, didn't they? At least in Antioch, they were given equal status. They were eating together with circumcised Jews as equals. This was a new way of being human together, and it had this tangible form and this manifestation of the Spirit. Those were Paul's arguments for his claims, his big claims. But how successful were they? Was Paul believed? What did his audience, his jury, have to say? Paul's political message that Kyrios Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ is the Lord, as well as his social message that is a new humanity, new way of being human together was created, met with some success, but with a lot of scorn, rejection, and violent opposition. That's detailed ad nauseum in Paul's letters and in Acts, which the book describes in great detail. Paul himself was subject to beatings, arrest, imprisonment, near-death experiences, and depression. He preached that the new creation was launched by Jesus Messiah, and he invented a new humanity based on loyalty to Jesus. These are the claims of the book. But in fact, the actual evidence presented that would suggest that those claims were justified is very underwhelming for the following reasons. First, what Paul was preaching, Jesus, this crucified man, was the universal Lord, and he rose from the dead, was simply nonsensical. Who's going to believe that? Yet he kept on repeating it, for, as Tom says, that's what he did. Second, most Jews remained convinced that loyalty to Torah was essential to the fulfillment of messianic expectation. So they weren't going to accept anything short of that. Third, non-Jews were intolerant of religious diversity, and they rejected the gods that Paul proclaimed, Jesus and anastasis, or resurrection. And fourth, there was simply no exemption from emperor worship for non-Jews, but only for Jews. They had that exemption. So non-Jews who gave up idol worship to confess only Jesus as Lord lived in a no man's land. There just wasn't room for them if they were giving up worshiping Caesar for worshiping Jesus. So Wright's arguments seem to suggest that Paul made big claims with little evidence to back them up for the reasons I just stated. Namely, Jesus was the universal Lord on earth, and a new humanity was invented of those loyal to him, but wherever you looked, it was hard to see these claims mirrored in the cities where Paul had preached. The Antioch incident is clear. The Jews withdrew, including Barnabas, from table fellowship with Gentiles. People came to the Galatian churches. They started preaching, you've got to circumcise and obey the law. Things started to fall apart there, etc. So if this is correct, that Paul had these big claims, but little evidence really to back them up, why would anyone write a biography of Paul? Especially, why would Tom Wright write a biography of Paul? So it seems to me that the Paul that Wright has described in the book would have been relegated to a footnote in the annals of early Christian history and not celebrated by the writing of a biography worthy of a panel discussion and a distinguished lectureship. So a better way, I would suggest, to account for the incredible impact that Paul actually did have on early Christian history up to the present day is to say that Paul did not proclaim Jesus as presently universal Lord on earth, but as the universal Lord in heaven, who is coming to earth soon to judge the world. So you better get ready. This went for both Jews and non-Jews. So, if that's the thesis, what would Paul have said? To the polytheists in his audience, he would have said, don't follow the example of Ischomachus, the Greek householder who describes his household duties in relation to the gods as follows. He says, I start by cultivating the goodwill of the gods, and I try to behave so that it may be right for me, my friends, when I pray, to acquire good health, physical strength, distinction in the city, goodwill among my friends, survival with honor in war, and wealth that has been increased by honest means, end quote. And also, Xenophon says, the Greek householder says, it's a pleasure to honor the gods magnificently. Well, Paul would have said, if you think the gods are going to help you and your household now, wait till you see what they will do for you when Jesus comes back. You'll be toast. It's better to be an atheist now, that is, not to believe in the gods, and suffer the scorn and ill treatment of your fellow polytheist neighbors, than to be a polytheist at the parousia. What would Paul have said to the Jews or the non-Jews who wanted to keep the Jewish law? He probably would have said, give up seeking righteousness through the law of Moses. It was given to reveal God's will and to expose your sin. It can only lead to your condemnation when Jesus returns as the universal Lord and Judge. Why do you think that Peter and I sought to be justified in Christ? Because we realized we are sinners just like the Gentiles, even though we have the law. And further, if I'm building up what I used to tear down, the church of God in Christ, I prove that I, a Jew, not a sinner, am a transgressor after all. I'm one of those transgressors that I used to distinguish myself from on the basis of the righteousness of the law. How did Paul come to know himself as a transgressor, even though he was a Jew and a keeper of the law? He suggests by interpreting the death of Jesus differently than Tom does in the book, namely as, well, he does that also, but not to the extent that I think he should. By interpreting the death of Jesus as suffering of the penalty for sin according to the law. In Galatians 3:13, Paul writes, the Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. When Paul states, through the law, or in the previous chapter, through the law I died to the law. No longer I live, but Christ lives in me. I think he's reflecting this understanding of Jesus' representative death as suffering the penalty for sin that the law pronounces on transgressors. And because Jesus' death under the penalty for sin, standing in the place of the transgressor, incorporates Paul, it frees him from the future condemnation for being a transgressor at the coming day of judgment. That's why Paul said, I may be a Jew, but I'm no different from the non-Jews that I'm preaching to. So this was Paul's message that could be compelling to non-Jews in particular, that Jesus is the coming Lord of the world, who's coming to earth as the judge. And this message did not oppose a present earthly universal lordship of Caesar, because it was a coming. Jesus is a heavenly universal Lord, and he was not yet coming, had not yet come, but he was coming. So the clash there between emperor worship and worshiping Jesus as universal Lord wasn't quite so stark. So Paul's big claim is not as big as Wright says, I think, that Jesus is Messiah, presently universal Lord in heaven, and coming soon to exercise his lordship on earth. And finally, what was the new way of being human together, or the utopia? I don't think had never been tried before, because we do know that ancient people had ideals about utopian communities, whether they were real or imagined or not, that overcame the kind of ethnic differences and geographical specificity. For example, virtue was thought to unite all people that were divided by different customs. But my time is running out. And so I would simply suggest that to say that Paul's understanding of Jesus' death as a death that incorporated and represented transgressors is a better basis for the new way of being human together, because it eliminates the potential for developing distinctions between people. If we're all transgressors, we're not going to fight over who's a better transgressor. And that forms a better basis than, I believe, loyalty to Jesus, because that can quickly devolve into, well, I can be more loyal to Jesus. I can die for Jesus. I can be a martyr. And that's indeed what happens. You get in the later church, this martyr ideology and so forth. So my suggestion is that both of those big claims of Paul might not be quite as big as Wright has suggested in the book.
Thank you very much. Dr. Smith.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to sit on this panel and to review your book, Tom. It's an honor. I'm going to do a little bit of something different in that I will be giving a sort of broad strokes, appreciative reading of the overall task of the historian that is modeled in the book. And then I will be using chapters 9 through 12 parts as examples of what I mean in terms of what you can take away from the book, in terms of what Tom is up to, I think. Insightful, illustrative, imaginative, instructive, compelling. These are just a few of the descriptive modifiers I found myself thinking as I read and reread Wright's narrative biography of Paul. Wright's narrative reconstruction reintroduces readers to Paul from new angles, with new images that distill fresh perspectives of what Paul was possibly up to, what he was plausibly encountering that was both uplifting and challenging, as well as the ruptures and reconciliatory experiences unfolding within his kinship networks. We thought we knew Paul as readers of early Christian literature, and yet Wright guides us through reading Paul with new eyes. For biblical historians, Wright's biography of Paul both models and challenges us to reconsider how we go about constructing historical narratives and biographies of early Christian figures for whom much ink has already been expended. For the sake of time, I want to focus on two features of Wright's book, namely the historian's task and the role of images, while also highlighting chapters 9 through 12 as I go. The first commendable feature of Wright's book, as I stated, is how he understands and executes the task of a historian and biographer of Paul. Wright describes the task of his book as providing a reconstruction of the history of Paul, considering all the relevant evidence about his life available to modern people before sifting the evidence into what is and is not usable for constructing a plausible story of Paul's life. In Wright's biography of Paul, one is not simply on a journey reading an exhaustive encyclopedic description detailing the story, motivations, and profile of Paul from a disinterested and value-neutral place. Rather, readers are situated in a proverbial classroom with Wright, seeing the multifaceted task of historian at work, in which there are three major elements, I would suggest. Historical reconstruction is in the room, theological imagination is in the room, and hermeneutical storyteller is in the room. In this way, Wright's book conveys two different types of information. One is a profile and history of Paul, and the other is a template for how to go about the work of Christian historiography, or I would even say hagiography, when the sources are fragmented and of different quality, genres, perspectives, and even provenance. Wright's approach to writing a biography of Paul, in my mind, can be represented by two images. One image embodies the performance of the colloquial expression, one step forward, two steps back. We are constantly being invited to step back from Paul and look at the world that produced Paul and in which Paul lived from different angles. Only once Wright has crafted the world of Paul with his attitudes, practices, social arrangements, religious and political sensibilities, cultural norms, and ethnic pluralisms, does he then step back up to the Pauline biography and offer compelling and plausible, sometimes problematic, readings on how to understand the Pauline story. Indeed, chapter 9, Corinth 1, is an exemplary model of this approach. Wright opens the chapter on Paul and Corinth by stepping away from Paul and inserting readers into the sensory world of Corinth first. Wright paints the picture of Corinth as a city located on the Isthmus of Greece, connected to Athens and Sparta. Through his pen, readers have a chance to look around Corinth and see its fresh springs, its high traffic and land routes, the Corinthian Forum that includes the imperial cult, as well as local temples such as Aphrodite, Poseidon, Asclepius, as well as family deities. One envisions the transience of the place with people from all over the Roman world coming in and out of the city. Some are Roman freedmen, others are ex-slaves, some are Roman and non-Roman business people, soldiers, teachers, philosophers. Wright gives readers a sense of the huge social imbalance that exists in the city when he says, quote, "Few rich, many poor, and at least half the population in any case is enslaved." It is only once readers can virtually see Corinth through their mind's eye that Wright inserts Paul into the world, leveraging Acts 18 as well as the letter of 1 Corinthians. We are constantly in a dance of one step forward and two steps back in Wright's biography, and we enjoy the choreography. The second image that comes to mind, and this is kind of a fun one, it is the vintage toy that was called Viewmaster. It was very popular in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. The Viewmaster was, just in case you can't remember what it was, the Viewmaster was a red, at least mine was red, a red toy camera in which you insert a circular reel of images to view. You look through the camera lens and you pull down the lever and it rotates the film reel to the next image. You have a picture of what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. As a child, when I looked through the lens, I had the sense of looking in on something and getting a sneak peek at an image or a moment that no one else was privy to unless they took the camera from me and looked through the lens at that particular reel and that specific image. I found myself reliving a version of that while reading Wright's book. Wright provided a sort of in-the-house narration of the interaction between Saul and his father, for example, in chapter 1. He locates the initial theological formation and cultural socialization of Saul in the household under the teaching of his father. He defines the Pharisaism of Paul as first and foremost the Pharisaism of his father, saying, quote, "But as Saul's father would no doubt explain, Sabbath by Sabbath, the Goyim were still a threat. And the more you read the old stories, the more you would see how the Goyim would try to pull loyal Jews away from the name, from the one God. And we, by which Saul's father wouldn't just mean we Jews, but we Parashim, we Pharisees, have to stay pure. And we must be ready to act when the time comes, end quote. Wright's recasting of Saul within the larger kinship and family network, committed to a very particular Jewish ancestral form of life, provides a vision of Paul as a family member and a family man that is often not attributed to him in the way that you find with someone, say, like Peter, who I'm interested in. The book's opening portrayal of Saul as one nurtured by a Pharisaic-oriented family committed to the prophetic zealot tradition demands we take seriously that Paul is a figure who is the product of a dyadic society in which individual identity is communal identity, communal convictions, communal sensibilities, and communal practices. We get this sort of view master or in-the-house narration occurring also in Paul's later career in chapter 9 to 12. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of this in-the-house insider view occurs in chapter 10, Ephesus, where Wright describes the internal rupture and depression that is on display in the letter of 2 Corinthians. He says, when we read 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians in quick succession, especially in Greek, we are aware at once that something has happened. The style is different. The second letter feels as if it is being dragged out of Paul through a filter of darkness and pain. In chapter 10, Wright takes us on Paul's journey from despair into hope. He places the prison letters as written from an Ephesus imprisonment that ultimately deepened Paul's discipline of Jesus-focused prayer and liturgical practice in a way that impacts how Wright talks about Paul in chapter 11 and following. Ultimately, the focus and structure of Wright's book is a testament to what studies of early Christianity can yield when a defined focus, such as Paul, as an historical figure who appears across multiple ancient sources, is coupled with a commitment to making him accessible and human to readers at a distance chronologically, geographically, linguistically, culturally, and socially, politically. In my view, through his nuanced examination and narration of Paul, Wright's book presents a pivot in how to approach the study of topoi from early Christianity, Second Temple Judaism, the Greco-Roman world in general. And Wright showcases the best of early Christian historiography in which historical reconstruction, theological imagination, and hermeneutical storytelling are essential ingredients. Thank you.
Thank you. Each of our panelists have such marvelous things to say. I feel like a heel standing up because I want to hear more of what they've got to say. But this is the nature of my task I was given by Todd Still, who's going next, and I'm sure will be clocking in at 10 minutes.
You certainly will now. Thank you, colleagues. My pleasant task this afternoon is to review and reflect upon roughly the last 100 or so pages of Tom's insightful and enjoyable treatment of the life of Paul. Chapter 13 is aptly entitled Jerusalem Again, as Paul, a diaspora Jew, had a penchant for traveling to the holy city both prior to and subsequent to his life-altering encounter with the risen Jesus en route to Damascus. The visit in view here, known as the collection visit, would prove to be his last to Jerusalem the Golden. In Romans 15, Paul describes this would-be visit as both a diakonia and koinonia to the impoverished saints there. Through the gathering of the collection and its delivery, two bedrock Pauline convictions and commitments coalesce, as Wright rightly notes, namely, that the poor are to be remembered, and that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. After helpfully sketching out how tricky and treacherous such a journey carrying money would have been in Paul's day, Tom highlights two recorded events in Acts 20 that transpired along the way: the accidental death and miraculous raising of Eutychus in Troas, and Paul's address to the Ephesian elders in Miletus. For the balance of the chapter, Tom more than less offers a substantive summary of the narrative of Acts 21 to 26, noting along the way Lucan lacuna and Acts' tendency to telescope. At the end of chapter 13 in Tom's book, and chapter 26 in Acts, then, we are ready to set sail for Italy. Having journeyed from Corinth to Jerusalem to Caesarea in AD 57, and having appealed to Caesar after 2 years of Caesarean imprisonment, Paul, at long last, is bound for Rome as a bound man, a prisoner of Caesar. The third and final part of Tom's book on Paul, entitled The Sea, is comprised of 2 chapters. In chapter 14, from Caesarea to Rome and beyond, Tom once again follows the narrative set forth in Acts, and reasonably so, Lucan compression, stylization, and idealization notwithstanding. After anything but a smooth sail, Luke is able to announce in Acts 28:14, and so we came to Rome. When Luke's narrative ends, reporting that Paul remained in Rome under house arrest for 2 years while waiting his day in court, our questions begin to mount, not least what happened to Paul. Before tending to that question, however, Tom is at pains to pose and respond to the question, was Paul really a loyal Jew? Tom concludes, he was loyal to Israel's traditions as he had seen them rushing together in the Messiah. He was loyal to the Messiah himself, faithful to the one who had been faithful to the point of death. One gathers that loyalty, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. But ever since Paul's conversion stroke call, his all-consuming passion and magnificent obsession was to know Christ Jesus his Lord. All else paled in comparison. What happened to Paul at the end of his Roman captivity circa AD 62? That is the proverbial $64 question. Tom sketches some of the more plausible options, but is appropriately cautious and circumspect in my estimation. Taken together, it appears that Tom thinks it more probable than not that Paul was released from captivity, traveled to Spain, made his way back east, and wrote to Timothy in Rome prior to his execution in the mid-60s AD. Tom brings his exciting and expansive tome on Paul to a close in chapter 15, entitled The Challenge of Paul. Noting that Paul's starting point and goal was Jesus, Tom then reiterates the aim of the Pauline mission: to establish and maintain communities of Christ followers comprised of both Jews and Gentiles who worship one God through Jesus his Son by the power of the Spirit. Moreover, these cross-shaped, Spirit-inspired, Scripture-informed communities were to be marked and animated by love for and loyalty to God, who is setting the world to rights through the crucified, resurrected Lord Jesus Christ. Paul, and those with whom he lived and moved and had his being, strove to live under the banner, the whole person to the whole gospel. Next, Tom turns his attention to the question, why did Paul's life and ministry bear such lasting fruit? Wright's response is multifold, and rightly so. To be sure, God enabled it. That being said, Paul's energy, honesty, and transparency also played a pivotal part. Then, of course, there are Paul's letters, and the church is shaped by the same, called the unity and holiness. Ultimately, the heirs of the Pauline assemblies would go on to set up hospitals and educate people. Indeed, Christian congregations would perform all sorts and sundry of service for broader ambient culture, and in so doing shine as lights. Some, though not all, of these ecclesial breadcrumbs can be traced back to Paul, whose life and work still informs and instructs the church today. Prayer is the final answer that Tom offers to the question why the Pauline mission succeeded. Furthermore, Tom imagines, along the lines of the later Rabbi Akiba, that Paul was praying something akin to 1 Corinthians 8:6 when dying. Interestingly, I have wondered similarly, but have inclined toward Philippians 1:21. Ta zen Christos ta apathenon kerdos, to live Christ, to die gain. Regardless, Paul, the man mountain as R.S. Thomas calls him, loved the Lord in life and death, and willed that others might do the same. Given the scope, scale, size, and success of this volume, the questions arising from my reading and review of chapters 13 to 15 seem minuscule, if not inconsequential. I do, however, have a few questions offered to be sure in a spirit of warm collegiality, respect, and congratulations. Allow me to tick them off one after another. Is Mark standing yet?
No, you're good for another 2 minutes and 48 seconds.
1. Wow, the Baptist preacher finishes under time.
Wow.
1. Do you think that Paul anticipated, Tom, the Parousia during his lifetime? And would such an expectation have an appreciable impact on Pauline interpretation? Maybe a similar way of asking Judy's question. 2, do you think it likely that the only letter Paul wrote subsequent to Romans was to Timothy? Are you at all open to a Roman provenance for one or more of the captivities? 3, my final question is actually one that you raise on page 429 and purposefully do not address. So in some ways it's unfair. In some ways. What difference might it make if the church in our own day were to reassess its policies and priorities in the light of Paul's work? Given that each of the panelists are theological educators and that many in the audience are committed Christ followers, this strikes me as both a pertinent, pressing, and even compelling question. Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom, we have exactly 20 minutes before we're supposed to be out of here. So we're running about 30 minutes behind schedule. My question to you is, you want to respond, you should respond, it's what people want to hear. But there is some Q&A that I'd love, so do it within measure of how you deem the time most useful, please.
Thanks, Mark. And my great thanks to Mark, to his administrative team, and to the panel for this extraordinary honor of, when you write a book, you want people to read it, but actually you really want them to discuss it, and they're doing that, and that's great. And I have to say, particularly to Seyoon Kim and Judy Gundry, I wish I had had your comments when I was at sort of second draft stage, because there's lots of things, and this always happens when you write a book. You write and write and write and write. Somebody says, you missed out this bit. Oh, God. It's the trouble with theology is you have to say everything all the time, otherwise people think you've deliberately missed something out. I take Seyoon's point perfectly well that I may not have highlighted grace. That's like, oh, how did that happen? I'm taking it for granted everywhere, but yes, I no doubt should have foregrounded it much more. Let me just work very quickly through honoring what Mark said. The question of what Paul was doing when he went to Arabia. He says, I had been persecuting the church because I was exceptionally zealous for the traditions of my fathers. The Greek is perisoteros zelotes huparkon, patrion, whatever it is, the traditions of my fathers, patriarchon paradosion. And the zelotes bit is crucial. In Jewish tradition, there are two models of zeal. One is Phineas, one is Elijah. This goes right through the rabbis. And when you go back to Elijah, when Elijah goes to say to God, what on earth's going on Mount Sinai, yes, Mount Horeb, he says, I have been exceedingly zealous for the Lord of hosts. In the Septuagint, it's zelon et zeloka. With zeal have I been zealous for the Lord of hosts. And then God says to him, go return again to Damascus. Paul says, what did he do after going to Arabia? I returned again to Damascus. It's a direct echo. It seems to me Paul is deliberately saying, I was doing the Elijah thing, and he went back to anoint a new king, and I went back to announce the newly anointed king. That was why I said what I did about going to Arabia. I want to follow up what you said about Isaiah 42:11, I think you said. That's not something that I'd considered. I remain, obviously, to be convinced, having only just heard of that now. And yes, the oikonomos theme, quite possibly, there's things there that could be worked out. That is, Paul as the steward, the one to whom something's been entrusted. An oikonomos is the sort of the head of the household, the CEO, not the director of the firm, but the one who makes the operations, perhaps the COO, correct, and director of operations. And Paul sees himself as being entrusted with stuff to do. That's absolutely fine, as far as I'm concerned. You said at the beginning, Seyoon, about because I take Acts seriously historically, as of course people like Martin Hengel have done, that it would make a lot of New Testament scholars, old ones, be turning in their graves by now. Well, maybe they need to, because because a great deal of New Testament scholarship was dominated by German liberal Protestantism, which had a prejudice against history specifically, and a prejudice particularly against Luke as a theologian of salvation history. That goes all the way through to Käsemann in the mid-20th century, and particularly a lot of German scholarship still, and quite too much American scholarship actually, is dominated by F.C. Bauer's split of Peter and Paul. And it seems to me this spills over into Judy's point about what happened in Antioch, that so many people wanted there to be a split so that we had Pauline Christianity versus Petrine, which would then feed into various Hegelian formations of how early Christianity happened. I think, there aren't any 19th century German liberal Protestants still around. Why do we have to kowtow to them? But this goes for a great deal in seminary education to this day, because it's a tradition which gets passed on, the Patricone Paradosion again, as with Paul. Let me just say, before I switch to Judy, one word about something which none of the panel have mentioned, because, of course, they too are highly constrained by time, as you saw. One of the main things I was trying to do in this book, which I hope has happened, is I wanted to contextualize the letters so that you're walking with Paul down the street and you're worrying about what he's doing, you're praying about what's going on, so that you understand from within why, of course, he has to write this letter now, rather than just meeting the letters as a sort of a blob of inspired scripture which suddenly arrive on your doorstep. So I was trying to do with Paul's letters what Robert Harris does in his novels about Cicero, where you understand why Cicero has to make this speech now and what it means in his society and culture, etc. So I hope that comes. And so there are mini expositions of all the letters. Answering one of Todd's questions before I go any further, it is possible that Paul wrote other letters as well as to Timothy after writing Romans. I do not know about the second journey to the east, which you have to say if he wrote 1 Timothy, because the personalia and the travelling details, 1 Timothy and Titus, don't fit with the narrative of Acts. They simply don't. Therefore, if Paul wrote them, it must be at some later stage. That's perfectly possible. I started off thinking that Philippians, Colossians, Ephesians, and Philemon were written in Rome, and I was chased out of that by, I would say, the evidence of the texts themselves, particularly Colossians and Philemon, but it is possible that Philippians might, as I say somewhere, have a different opus number, as it were, but I think it works extremely credibly there. So to Judy, you said so many nice things, and then suddenly you swung around in the middle and said there's big claims and little evidence. Now, I'm not sure about the little evidence. Paul says in writing to Colossae, Epaphras has made known to us your love in the Spirit, and I take it that means Epaphras has come back from Colossae and said, there's a new community there. Jews and Greeks, slaves and free, male and female, loving one another as family even though they're not family. And this to Paul is the sign that God is at work. There are things like, and likewise when Paul talks to the Philippians and to the Thessalonians, there's something special about the northern Greek churches where he says, you are our glory and our joy. You are the proof of my apostleship. That's to Corinth as well. There are communities that exist that he says, this shows that I have not run in vain or labor in vain, which is a kind of a mantra. He's always going back to that phrase from Isaiah 49, the worry about the servant. So I think that there was evidence, though Paul worried that it mightn't always be as much as one might think. But particularly, I was astonished when you said that Paul didn't proclaim Jesus as Lord on earth, but only in heaven. So that, of course, sets Paul right against Matthew 28, where all authority is given to Jesus on earth as well as in heaven. I'll be talking about that, God willing, in the lecture this evening. I think the line of thought, as I think you said, from Romans 1, 3 to 5 through to Romans 15, 12 and 13, is very clear. Jesus is Lord already and has been installed as so, declared in power by the resurrection of the dead. I think Philippians 2 makes the same point. Of course, Paul believes that Jesus is coming back. I think that Paul believed, certainly to begin with, that this would happen during his lifetime. I think by 2 Corinthians and Philippians, he believes that it will happen at any time and that he might himself have died. Paul always believes in the parousia, and it seems to me what changes is his own perspective. He realizes he might well die ahead of time. And yes, when Jesus comes back, he will be visibly, manifestly, etc., Lord of all. Philippians 3:20 following, he will change our lowly body to be like his glorious body, etc. But I was astonished. I need to think what's going on. And I think with Seyoon as well, there's a bit of a pushback against a political reading of Paul. And I totally agree what you said about justification, about him suffering the law's penalty for sin. Romans 8, 3 and 4. There is 1 to 4. There is no condemnation because on the cross God has condemned sin in the flesh. That is representative penal substitution in service of the victory of Christ over all the powers as celebrated at the end of Romans 8. So, I mean, that's part of a different conversation. That's the Atonement book, which we discussed last time I was here. But so I'm not getting rid of that, and I'm not getting rid at all. This is to Seyoon as well, of the theology of justification that goes with that. And for me, it's a both and, because with Paul, it's a both and. Ephesians 2, 1 to 10 goes with Ephesians 2, 11 to 22. The two are absolutely bound up. If you like, old perspective and new perspective, they're brought together in Ephesians, just like Jew and Gentile are brought together in Ephesians, and so on. So but the point about Jesus dealing with sins on the cross, and this is so emphatic in Galatians, is that therefore any Jewish Christian who says, well, we're not sure if these uncircumcised Gentiles are allowed in, has to be reminded that that which was wrong about Gentiles, namely that they were idolaters, sinners, impure, etc., that's been dealt with on the cross. And if you say that even though they're in the Messiah by baptism and faith, they're still not welcome here, is a way of saying the cross wasn't effective. Paul says, if that was so, the Messiah might as well not have died. So those are the main objections. Shively, I naturally loved what you did. I think, yes, the history thing, and I loved your Viewmaster thing, because you're going, I had one of those too, but it wasn't red. You're going into, you feel you're going into the thing. That's exactly what the historian is trying to do. And actually, though we talk about the historical critical method in biblical scholarship, I think many, many biblical scholars have fought shy of trying to do that kind of construction, as though it's got too much subjectivity in it, so we can't be sure if it's sort of scientific history. I'm sorry, history aims at a narrative, and that narrative always includes human motivations. And if you're not doing that, you're not actually doing history. It's a faux history which comes with cultural and philosophical context attached to it. Last questions from Todd. Parousia, 2 Timothy. What difference might it make to reassess priorities in the light of Paul? I've said again and again, if Paul would come back today, the thing that would most shock him about Western Christianity is not just that we are disunited, but that it doesn't bother us. He would say, how on earth can you witness to the powers if you've got 25 different churches in every town, or 225 churches? It's only when the body of Christ learns to live together, which is what every letter of Paul is about, in one way or another, the unity of the church. Now, of course, you can't have unity at the cost of holiness. And I've said times without number, unity is easy if you don't care about holiness. Holiness is easy if you don't care about unity. Trust me, I'm a bishop, I know. That Paul insists on both. That's tough. That's the conversation we need to have. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, recognizing my guys need some time to tear this down, so we do really have a hard stop time-wise that maybe I can fudge on a little bit. Let me begin with this. So I think Tom has fairly said, and I think several people have indicated, that there is a great level of subjectivity as opposed to objectiveness when you're discussing anything of historical critical nature. I've got a friend who gives Holy Land tours all the time, and he's got a grading system. A means, yeah, this is it. B means, we have good reason to think this is it. C means, D means, probably not. F means, there's no way. Okay? And he takes people to sites. He says, this is a B, this is a C. When you wrote this book, recognizing how subjective often your surmisements are to give us the viewmaster view, did you say, okay, this is an A, I'm pretty confident about this. This is a B, I feel pretty good about it. This is a C. And then you left out the D's and F's? Or do you sell yourself on it totally before you put it in the book?
It's a great question, though I would want to reframe it, and we haven't got time to do it in detail, but the objective-subjective divide is precisely what a Pauline epistemology would transcend, and a genuine historical epistemology would transcend. That's why I and others have talked about an epistemology of love, in which subjectivity and objective are both transcended, so that the historian is always trying, this is one of the primary things a historian does, to think into the minds of people who think differently to ourselves. Now, in order to do that, it's very easy to project your own ideas, and that falsifies it. That's not a hermeneutic of love, that's actually lust. That's actually using that, whatever the historical object is, to project your own fantasies onto. So the thing about history is it's a public discipline. It's always saying, here's a hypothesis, I'm putting it out there for debate, thank you very much. Then we get pushback, then we say, now, okay, I'll try saying it this way. So every work of history, like every hypothesis in science, is another move in that ongoing process of knowledge. So I would say, yeah, nothing is ever finished. This is where I am at the moment. I would say there are several things here which I am absolutely confident of. There are some things which I say in the book, I really don't know about the pastoral epistles, whether they were written then, whatever. I really can't be sure if Paul got to Spain. I think that's likely. I would say that's perhaps about a C on your scale. I have come to the view that the prison letters being written in Ephesus, certainly Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon, I would say it's an A or a B. I know a lot of people would disagree with that, and we'll have the discussion. That's fine. But so most of what I'm doing here, I think, is ABC, and I'm trying as a hypothesis to say, if that is so, can we understand the motivations of Paul? Can we understand the twists and turns of his personal wrestlings, agonizings, etc.? Does it settle down and make sense? And this is what historians do all the time. It's one stage in an ongoing hypothesis. Yeah.
Okay, marvelous. So let's take some other historical information we've got and tell me if this is fair to inject into the Pauline discussion. Strabo was an early fathers. He did like tour books almost, a geography they would call it of the ancient world, talking about Tarsus and people from Tarsus. He said, quote, they instantly speak offhand and increasingly on any subject. Fair to inject that into Paul?
Possibly. I think Paul was seldom lost for words, though 2 Corinthians implies a moment of darkness which he plunged into where he might have been lost for words. The thing about Tarsus is it's a melting pot of philosophy as well as culture, and I think Paul is absolutely up for that. I think he relishes it, and that probably does mean that he's quite happy to have a go at every subject that comes up.
So we know historically Tarsus, one of the key features of the town was the gymnasium. Right there by the river, huge gymnasium town, huge athletic town. Do you see that in the writings of Paul?
Yeah, you see athletic imagery in 1 Corinthians, for instance.
As opposed to agrarian imagery that you might see more in the Gospels with Jesus?
Well, yes, quite. Though you have to be careful because there's two things going on with imagery in the Bible. This is what one of the things Shively was talking about. One is, local color from the culture there. The other is echoes of Scripture and echoes of the scriptural narrative. And sometimes we can mistake the one for the other. And something that's actually coming out of a retold Exodus story, for instance, might be mistaken for simply a bit of local color. I think Paul is quite happy to weave those together.
All right, I want to merge from the difficulties of historical context, and I want to press you a little bit. And if you guys want to chime in on pressing him, or you want to tell us he's wrong, y'all do it. But I'm tending to target these to Tom because we robbed him of all of his 20 minutes. So first thing I talked to you about is the difficulties of historical context and getting into it. Second thing I want to talk to you about are the imaginations, your imagination that illuminates ambiguity within Scripture. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain ambiguity of what Paul did after his Jerusalem experience, Arabia, what it was, what it wasn't. You addressed the Mount Sinai end of it. When you make those determinations, is there ever part of you that says, nobody's writing on this. This will be a good bit in the book. It will cause some buzz. It'll cause the dialogue. Do you throw things in for that reason?
Not quite like that, but...
I will admit the lawyer in me's coming out on this, but I mean, like the Sinai. I thought that Seyoon made a good point. Paul disses Sinai in his illustration in Galatians.
But I think that's why he doesn't say, I went away to Sinai. That's why he says, I went away to Arabia. And when he gets back to it in Galatians 4:25, it's a very difficult text because it's one of the most complicated manuscript tradition bits in Galatians. But I think what he says is, Sinai is a mountain in Arabia. He's lining, and so I think he's saying, actually, I did that, but that was where you had to go because he was channeling Elijah, but that it wasn't the main thing. That's not the real thing. That I actually wrote an article about that about 20 years ago, which is republished somewhere. So I was drawing on that. Quite a lot of this book is actually drawing on stuff that I've worked out with footnotes elsewhere.
The first speaker we had in the library was Father Justin, the librarian at St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai. And obviously one of the big issues is where is Mount Sinai? And St. Catherine's makes the claim based upon the work of Constantine's mother, but that's based upon the reputation for hundreds of years at that point. So he would love what you're saying because that means that Paul knew where Mount Sinai was.
Wouldn't that be nice? Yes, I'm told. I mean, I've never been, sadly. I wish I could, but I do think that the word Sinai and the word Horeb may well have had fluid meanings by this time, and it's one of those big mountains down there that some people sometimes visit, but I'm not sure that they necessarily had a definite...
Okay, Samaria is where perhaps you didn't pursue, and I'm curious why.
Which?
Gamaliel.
Oh, yeah.
There is the reference that again, Seyoon made that you saw Paul in some ways more Hillel than Gamaliel. Did you make that statement?
I don't think that's what's...
He followed not Hillel's more humane approach, but the strict Shammite approach. Yeah. That's his claim. And I believe Gamaliel, that the tradition that Gamaliel was son or grandson of the Hillel, or at least a pupil of that Hillel school, is, I think, mistaken information. We don't know really where Gamaliel stood in this divide between Hillel and the Shammai, but at least it is true that Paul followed the Shammite line.
Yeah. Shammai being the rabbi who said, I can reduce the Torah down.
Well,
that's Hillel.
No, Shammai was the man who drove away with the measuring stick, the guy who wanted to... No, the point is, we tend to look at the debates between Hillel and Shammai with later rabbinic spectacles, where it's about strict interpretation of biblical law. But in the first century, it seems to me quite clear, not least because of the post-AD 70 controversies between, say, Yohanan ben Zakkai and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, that this is about not just how you interpret an individual bit of law, but what it means to be Jewish in the face of pagan oppression, etc. And Hillel says, live and let live, let the Romans run the world if they want, and we'll study Torah in private. Shammai says that's not good enough. God is the God of the whole world, Israel is his people, and particularly if Jews are compromising, they must be confronted and they must be dealt with, if necessary, with violence. It seems to be blindingly obvious that that's the line Paul took. And if his teacher Gamaliel would have disagreed with that, well, he wouldn't be the first pupil to disagree with his teacher.
Okay. But you do see Gamaliel, his love for the Septuagint. That he considered the Septuagint, and Paul carries it. Gamaliel writing letters to the synagogues, the first letter writer we know. Paul then models and writes letters.
Yes, though there's lots of other models as well, though that's an interesting question about genre, which I didn't get into in the book, as to what genres Paul chooses, because I think often it's quite fluid, actually. I'm not sure we can make a definite determination there.
Okay, that's why you leave that out. Okay, then the last area that I'll ask you about, and we will conclude this in the next 3 or 4 minutes, is somewhere in the process of the book, as a biography, you've got the difficulties of historical context, you've got the imaginations that will illuminate ambiguity to bring the readers in and to create buzz, though you wouldn't use it that way. And then you've also somehow in a biography managed to embed the theology of Paul that you hold, and you've done that wonderfully well. So I've got a couple of questions, and some prompted by Judy. And so for Paul, Jesus as Kurios, Lord, or Jesus as Messiah? Is there a distinction?
There's a distinction in meaning, but there's a convergence of person. And it seems to me, when you're drawing on Psalms the way that Paul does, Psalm 110, Psalm 8, Psalm 2 particularly, which happens in 1 Corinthians 15, that, by the way, is my main answer to you, that Jesus is already reigning until he's put all his enemies under his feet. We'll talk about what that means later, perhaps. That Jesus is Kyrios, Lord of the world, but part of his point is, when Israel's Messiah comes, read Psalm 2, he's going to be the Lord of the whole world. Read Psalm 72, his dominion will be from one sea to the other. Psalm 89 as well. The Messiah, Isaiah 11, the Messiah will be the ruler of the nations. That's absolutely clear. So, but the one leads to the other, as it were.
But we speak about the distinction and perhaps a message to the Messianic, or to the Jewish community versus that of the Goyim. To the Jews, they've been expecting a Messiah. They know a Messiah. The whole idea of an anointed king, if you will, does that even make sense to the Gentile world?
The idea of a Jewish king doesn't make much sense. The Gentile world doesn't want a Jewish king, thank you very much. They certainly don't want a crucified one, and they certainly won't believe in a resurrection from the dead one. But Paul would say the power of the Spirit goes out when you announce the message of the gospel, and people say, even though I know with my head this is crazy, it's just done something to me, and I feel the presence of Jesus and his transforming love, and here we are. And then particularly in the life of the church living under the rule of the Kyrios, it makes so much sense precisely in the new way of being human, which they do have to struggle for, obviously. And it's not just a given, oh, here we are. It's certainly not a utopia. But by the way, I do think it is far more than any of the utopias that any of the great philosophers might have envisaged, because they didn't envisage a community in which men and women would be on the same footing. They didn't envisage a community in which slaves and free would be on the same footing. And they certainly didn't achieve it. And Paul has these communities where that's a reality. And that, I think he would say, that's the sign that Jesus is Lord. This is Ephesians 3:10, that through the church, he polypoikilos sophia tou theo, the many-colored wisdom of God might be made known to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. For Paul, the existence of a community like this says to Caesar, you would like to have done this, but you couldn't. Guess what? It's happening here.
Okay, so would you join me in saying thank you?